I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. For those of you who don't know what that is, the voice and the audio, that's me. And I'm interviewing people in my old gig many, many years ago at a show called Fifth Estate, which is sort of Canada's version of 60 Minutes or maybe Panorama in the UK, interviewing people who needed to show some accountability. That's why I was being so aggressive. The one about the number of blows was a wrongful conviction case we'd done where we actually got a wrongly convicted man out of prison for a crime he had not committed, the murder of his wife. And that questioning about the number of blows was to one of the coroners who'd, in our view, and subsequently proven correctly, said she'd been beaten to death when in fact she'd fall down the stairs. So that was my old life, in case you're wondering what that was all about. This is my new life, and it is June 9th, and it's my birthday today, and I'm absolutely not saying a word about how old I am, although some of you probably know, because I have said my age, but like after 50, it's not for women, forget it. Like you sort of become invisible when you're 50, and most women my age, I'm way beyond 50, by the way, but most women my age will note when people stopped looking at them as a female, occasionally good-looking thing walking down the street, right? There's a point where we just kind of become non-existent in society, and I'm way beyond that. But I remember the day it happened. I exactly remember the day that it happened, but I'm way past that now, and I'm sort of used to it. So what are we doing today? Today is a really interesting show, kind of psychologically therapeutic and cognitively therapeutic too, if I can use that word. We're going to take a step backward and we're going to reassess how we ended up where we are, with most of us feeling that we inhabit a world where the major pillars of our lives have stopped making sense. And sometimes they feel threatening too. Obviously, living through 2 years of COVID-19 public health failure and censorship around the failure was very, very destabilizing for many of us. But it goes beyond that. Now that we've had a chance to take our breath and look at where we are societally and politically in the West, we are really struggling as a result of what I'm going to very kind of glibly call woke thinking and woke policy, which has taken over every cultural, media, and government institution and has been that way for a long time. COVID, I think, exposed it, but we're seeing it everywhere, and it's kind of over, right? The woman we are interviewing today, whose name is Joanna Williams, she's in the UK, has written a fabulous book called How Woke Won. And it did win. It won. And we have to figure out what we're going to do about it. But it is a very interesting framework through which to view the world now. Things will start to make sense. You know, the fact that our doctors only want to work from home. Our teachers seem to inhabit a different universe now. Instead of worrying about what they're teaching, they demand school closures and bring in their own sexual and race history politics inappropriately into the classroom. We don't want that. And even sexualizing children, which some of it does, right? The drag queen story hour, the kids don't need that. I support drag queens. I really do. But there's a time and place, and it's not in the classrooms or the libraries of the land, and it's not homophobic to say that. So I'm saying it. But this is all part of a woke culture that embraces this kind of identitarian focus on the world where groups that they perceive to be victims deserve all kinds of promotion forward beyond the point of it even being sensible or even really making any sense at all, right? Math is racist now. I mean, women can't be called women where things was, Yeah, we can't live this way anymore. But if you wonder why COVID was so ineptly and disastrously dealt with by the powers that be at all levels, I'm including media, government, bureaucracy, art, everything was captured by this woke ideology. And it is the woke ideology, in my view, that made the COVID response such a disaster. So we're going to talk about that today. She's figured it all out. We go through the history of it, how it started, why it's appealing to certain people, why the working class are now dog poo that's how they're treated by the left. They're either slandered for being racist or something by the left. They're certainly the farthest down the totem pole right now as far as, visibility and concern. They just have written them off. And where did we see that, people? We saw that with the truckers' protest, and that was absolutely fomented by JT, our Instagram Prime Minister. So we're going to sort some of it out. I thought it would be a bit of a tonic for us all because once it's in a framework, it feels less crazy. I mean, it's still crazy, but it feels less dangerous to us because we can understand maybe why people who we think are good people are now doing very bad, dangerous, stupid, and cruel things to us. So our guest, as I said, is Joanna Williams from the UK. She wrote a book called How Woke Won. She's written numerous academic journal articles and book chapters, as well as being a frequent contributor to national and international debates on education, feminism, and gender politics. She has written for a number of publications on different issues, BBC, Sky News, Radio 4. She's been a guest on all of these shows, and she's written for, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Spectator, the Guardian, the New York Post, and the American Conservative. So she'll be joining us in just a minute. I'll do the pitch now and get it out of the way. So the book winners for a book called Lost in Canada: An Immigrant's Second Thoughts by Lydia Perovich. There's a new subscriber and an old subscriber. That's how we did it. So they are Kevin, Rafe, and Andy Rose. So we're going to be contacting you, and you will send us your mailing address, and we will send you out the books. Lost in Canada. She was a guest on the show. Our new giveaway is going to be for 2 copies, same dynamic, a new subscriber, supporter / and an old subscriber for How Woke Won, the book we are doing today with Joanna Williams. So I'll draw those, and then I'll announce who you are, and you're going to send me your email address, and then I'll mail it out. Isn't that great? So we do require your support. Obviously, your moral support is great, and I get a ton of wonderful emails. I read them all at info@trishwoodpodcast.com. But your financial support is also really important. We don't just do the podcast here. We do a lot of investigative research as well that goes into a lot of the podcasts and other bits of content we're working back up to now because my long COVID is diminishing and I'm feeling a lot better. So in order for us to keep the lights on, we do really require outside support from you all, and it's very meaningful for us, and I'm always very grateful for it. So do consider our Patreon, our PayPal, and now I have a Substack going as well. The Patreon and the PayPal, if you go to my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com, and hit I think it's the support button or donate button, it will show you how to do that. So please do it, and do subscribe to the podcast as well, so you always know what we're up to. The other book that we are going to give away, I just bought 3 of them, is called How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom by Derek Smith, now a bestseller on Amazon as of today. It's a book about a kind of a comic book about how Prime Minister Trudeau unfairly dealt with the trucker convoy. So it's really fun. So we're going to send that out too. Same parameters. And we'll contact you and you can get in touch and we'll send it out. So isn't that great? How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom. The reason I bought 3 copies was because I think it's going to sell out pretty quickly and I wanted to have those to give away. Let's talk about the idea of when a conspiracy theory stops becoming a theory and becomes an actual conspiracy. And that is what we seem to be looking at as the Liberals dig themselves in deeper and deeper around activating the Emergencies Act against the truckers. I'm going to play you a little piece of tape. It is our public safety minister, whose name is Marco Mendocino, talking about how many times the police asked them to invoke the Emergencies Act. But as you're listening to it, hold this thought. Both the RCMP and the Ottawa police say they never did that. They didn't ask them to do it. But here's what he's saying in the House about how many times they asked him to do it. So these guys they're getting caught.
We invoked the Emergencies Act after we received advice from law enforcement. The advice we received was to invoke the Emergencies Act. Look, I don't want to speak for every last serving member of law enforcement, but there was a very strong consensus that we needed to invoke the Act. We invoked the Act because it was the advice of nonpartisan professional law enforcement. The advice that we were getting was that that law enforcement needed the Emergencies Act. It was only after we got advice from law enforcement that we invoked the Emergencies Act. And that advice came from very experienced law enforcement. We had to invoke the Emergencies Act, and we did so on the basis of nonpartisan professional advice from law enforcement. And that was the advice that we were receiving from law enforcement, and one of the main reasons why we invoked the Emergencies Act. We got the advice from our law enforcement that we'd met the threshold. They then came to their judgment, as you say, and thereafter, we came to ours on the basis of the advice that we were getting from law enforcement.
So let me just say why we ran that clip, because his office is saying that he was misunderstood. I don't think so. That's pretty clear, right? Here's what you need to know, that you can essentially lie that way. It seems like that's what he's doing in the House of Commons and sort of get away with it, right? That the truckers can't sue for libel for any of the things they said. And that's how the Liberal government right now, and I would say actually all of them, get away with quite a lot, because if they can find their remarks, they're lying to the House, they can get away with it. And that's what they're doing. So yeah, this is getting interesting. It's absolutely not getting the coverage in the legacy media it should, but there may be a bit of a spillover, There might be, Rex Murphy might shame them all into covering what is essentially a Watergate level scandal in this country that should be generating headlines. But, we live in hope that there'll be a change there. But it's a big story and you should be following it. And I will continue to follow it for you. So let me just remind you that this is being recorded on Thursday, June the 9th. And the reason I do that is not just because it's my birthday, but because tonight is the night that the January 6th committee will be broadcasting what a lot of smart people are calling a show trial, an extravaganza. They brought in a producer from Good Morning America to put together for them. These are the hearings into the January 6th riot and protest in the Capitol building that they are milking like crazy, because Biden's popularity it's in the toilet. The whole government's popularity is in the toilet. People are leaving the administration in droves. Even the left-wing enablers of Joe Biden are turning on him. So what do? They crank up the January 6th committee into a televised show trial in order to smear the Conservative Party, the GOP, Donald Trump and his supporters, to scare people into voting them back in as we approach the midterms. That's what's going on here. And I think I'm going to watch it tonight. And I would like you to, if you have time, I did an interview with Julie Kelly about January 6th. That was mind-blowing. And we also we traded stories about how the January 6th committee and the American media were using January 6th to smear all voters that aren't lefty voters. And Trudeau and his ilk are doing the same thing here. So, Julie Kelly, I can't remember what episode it is, sorry, but if you go to Apple or my website, trishwoodpodcast.com, it wasn't that long ago, you can scroll through and find Julie Kelly. You must listen to it. She's probably the best reporter working on that story right now. So it's quite interesting, the comparison she makes. So let's move on to our interview with Joanna Williams today. Here she is. We reached her in the UK. Hi, Joanna. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks, Trish. I'm really happy to be joining you this afternoon. Well, afternoon in the UK, that is.
Yeah, it'll be afternoon here soon. So I have to tell you, I'm really, really excited to have you on. I did read How Woke Won all the way through yesterday. And it answered a lot of questions for me about the way we're living now and what we are all being subjected to. A lot of it I view through the lens of COVID-19 policy, obviously, but because we do a lot of programming on this podcast. But your book, I'm sure there are others too, but your book for me at this time explained a lot about why people who haven't drunk that Kool-Aid, to put it kind of crudely, are so uncomfortable and feeling like the world has gone mad. You know, up is down, lies are truth, cruelty is kindness. I mean, it's just a very, very difficult time to be alive, on top of all of the other terrible things that are happening in our lives. So bravo for the book. And I want to use the book and the research and study you did to explain why we're all kind of feeling pretty cognitively dissonant these days. So let me start, I guess, just by getting from you your definition of what woke actually is. I think the phrase is used kind of glibly to encompass a bunch of stuff, but how do you describe it for the purposes of what we're about to explore?
No, sure. Thank you. And thank you very, very much indeed for your kind words about the book. It's a word that's very difficult to define, I think, and increasingly, I think that's possibly deliberate. I think people who are most woke don't like to be called out, and they don't like to be defined or even grouped together. And you often find the people who are most woke are the ones who are quickest to deny being woke at all. I guess what I mean by it is almost like an extreme form of the political correctness that we became aware of in the 1980s and 1990s would be one way of looking at it. People who are woke, who don't deny that they are woke, tend to say, oh, it just means being alert to social injustices. It just means being aware of racism or sexism. Who could possibly object to this? And I think they're being a bit disingenuous. I think they're being a bit dishonest when they say that, because it doesn't just mean being alert to social injustices. It means being alert to certain types of social injustices, the social injustices that they prioritize, that they think are important, and ignoring or overlooking other types of social injustices. So it means having a very heightened sense of social justice when it comes to gender or race, for example, but overlooking altogether social class inequalities, or actually being very contemptuous of working class people. But it also means responding to those injustices in a very prescribed and very authoritarian way that I think actually re-entrenches some divisions that were there in society, some inequalities that were there, that we were actually moving beyond, again, particularly in relation to race and gender inequalities that we had kind of moved on from, seem to be being reinvented under the label of woke thinking.
I think what you said is really interesting, because political correctness seemed like an annoyance. You know, it was a cultural pose. But I think the difference between political correctness now and what we're calling woke, which is a basket of stuff, is actually much more dangerous, because it has infected all of the power structures that underpin how we live. And in fact, I got this from your book, is it's infected the thinking of most of the people in the managerial class. Could you just explain for me how you kind of arrived at that idea?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess in the title of my book, the word one, I mean, this is how I'm defining one, that this ideological way of viewing the world has become the dominant and accepted view amongst people in every institution, it seems, that controls the world that we live in today. So from a UK perspective, I see woke thinking as really dominating, particularly our schools, our universities, the National Health Service, the civil service, the police, especially, even the army seems to have become dominated by woke thinking. But also capitalist institutions themselves, major corporations and companies. It's Pride Month here in the UK, and every shop on my local high street will have a rainbow flag in the window. So it's really become the dominant outlook. And I think universities especially have played a major role in bringing this situation about. I think we've had successive generations of graduates now who've come through universities with a degree certificate that enables them to walk into a job in one of these professional positions, if you like, becomes the entry requirement. And the degree certificate almost seems to do little more than signify that somebody has the correct vocabulary, knows the correct terminology to use, has this correct woke way of viewing and understanding the world, may not be able to write a coherent sentence, may not have any practical skills, but has thoroughly imbibed woke thinking. And so that then becomes the next generation of teachers, of managers, and they're particularly within the media as well. I think this is very dominant, and they're carrying that outlook out into the world with them.
It's very interesting because, I've noticed it happening. Obviously, we talk a lot about it on the show. I saw how it was exhibited, especially during COVID-19, when you had places like the CDC saying, well, we're not going to give the vaccine to the oldest people who really need it because they're mostly white. They actually had a meeting about it and said that, and it was well documented. That decision was rescinded. But the fact that people in healthcare could actually have those thoughts, it bowled me over. And I think I didn't really understand until I read your book, and I've read quite a lot about this. Is how pervasive it is. It's not an anomaly at all anymore. It's in the main. It is the basis through which all of the pillars of our democracy are moving now. Media, political parties, both left and right, the managerial class, advertising, cultural ideas, especially in popular culture, are all infected with this similar way of thinking that, according to your book, and I agree, is not sitting on a foundation of truth or even goodness or anything that bears a resemblance to what we thought those things were even 10 years ago. I mean, it's astonishing how pervasive it is.
No, completely. I really take on board the example that you're using there in relation to COVID, because we had the exact same discussion in the UK, particularly not so much in relation to who should get access to the vaccine, but in relation to, I guess, who was, and this is a very typical woke discussion, if you like, which group was the biggest victim of COVID, who was suffering most as a result of COVID. And very quickly, the narrative emerged that it was Black and minority ethnic groups that were targeted. And you just thought, particularly in the early days of COVID, if there was any time when it was inappropriate to have a discussion about identity politics, if there was ever a time not for political point scoring, it's in the face of a health crisis. Now, I mean, we can talk about it, and I think I'd probably agree with you very strongly that the way we as a society reacted to COVID was kind of completely out of all proportion. But there was a time in the early days when you thought, there is something seriously going on here.
Yeah.
But you also thought, perhaps I remember there being a little bit of an explicit discussion in the UK media. This is at the beginning of 2020. Perhaps now we'll move beyond identity politics. Perhaps now we've got bigger things to worry about. Well, that lasted about 6 weeks before we started seeing the whole of COVID itself through this lens of identity politics. The other thing that struck me as really interesting about that whole discussion was that, in a way, COVID was, not in a way, COVID was very, very discriminatory as an illness. It did attack elderly people much more than young people. And it also seemed to have, men seem to be worse affected by COVID than women. But exactly as you say, that group, particularly old men, particularly old white men, are the one group in society that you absolutely must not defend at all. You can't have anything remotely positive or even sympathetic to say about old white men. So the kind of contortions people jumped through to try and get us to take COVID as deadly seriously as we were expected to, whilst at the same time not appearing to be remotely sympathetic to old white men, was kind of very bizarre spectacle to have to watch.
And this is where the ideology frightens me, because when you say or even think for however long this edict was in play before somebody stepped in and said, you people are nuts, we're not doing this. But for however long this edict was in play at the CDC, if you pull the lens back on that, what they were saying is, we're prepared to let this group die because of our ideology. We've decided in our triage of vaccine hierarchy that this group of people, because they are white, is not worthy of what they believed. I have less confidence in the vaccines, but what they at the time believed was a kind of a pharmaceutical rescue from COVID, right? That's what scares me. It's not always just about, are they casting too many characters that aren't white? Are they, are we upset about language or trans extremists trying to push women out? But it's also the idea that life and death decisions are being made by this ideology that is at its core extremely unfair.
No, absolutely. I mean, we see that a lot in the UK as well, in discussions where, to put it very, very crudely, you almost divide people up into good victims and bad victims. And a good victim is somebody who fits the narrative, and a bad victim doesn't comply with the woke narrative, and so gets no kind of sympathetic media coverage, is almost just forgotten about. I mean, the classic example in the UK, we've had a number of large instances, horrifying instances of girls in working class communities, particularly in the north of the UK, girls who, for one reason or another, are perhaps in a children's home, are no longer with their family, who've been groomed, sexually groomed, given drugs, kind of sexually abused, particularly by gangs of Muslim heritage Asian men. And this has been a major scandal in the UK. But if you just looked at the front pages of our newspapers, you barely register the fact that this had happened. And yet we've also had, in the wake of Me Too, some quite high profile stories of women who've already got a bit of a media profile. They're perhaps news, journalists or politicians who, maybe 20 years ago went out for lunch with a man who then he put his hand on her knee, or, she was groped. Not remotely pleasant, or, I'm not saying for one second this was a good thing to have happened, or, not, it was something bad that happened.
Yeah.
But they were hardly teenage victims of rape. And yet they will become the stuff of front page news stories because they're the right kind of victim. They're middle class women who are incredibly articulate, but more to the point, the perpetrator, the person who they're blaming, tends to be an older middle class white male politician. Whereas the poor teenage girls who've been victims of sexual assault, because the person who'd perpetrated the crime against them tends to be Asian men, Muslim men. People feel very, very uncomfortable pointing the finger and saying, what's going on in that community? Why is this happening? So it becomes much easier just to sweep the discussion under the carpet and pretend that this hasn't happened. So you've got
that is a sickening example of what we see here in the news media too. I mean, I could go on about the news media for a week and not shut up. I'm so depressed about what they've become, but especially as someone who was a very high-profile journalist back in the day before this happened. But we had the same thing happen here, where with the when there is a white mass shooter or mass killer of some sort, it's huge news, and they ascribe the skin color and they subscribe and discuss the crime itself through that context. And yet, in the case of there was the Waukesha fellow who drove into a Christmas parade and killed a number of people in a car. He was black, and he had on his social media, he was a white nationalist and he wanted to kill white people. That story died, and they would not talk about it in the same way that they talk about incidences of the same ilk perpetrated by people who aren't black. They buried that. And part of that story too that was upsetting was it happened right after Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted. And the media had been so inflaming the public over the Kyle Rittenhouse acquittal, even to the point where they were polling people and even people in the media who thought that Kyle Rittenhouse had shot black people that day, right? So it was in this petri dish that the media is very, very selective about race and how they cover stories. And like you said in your very first answer about how woke skews people's perceptions, judgments have already been made before the story is even written. And that is kind of the dangerous part of this, right? Like, I don't think that the guy who drove his truck into the Christmas parade is any better or worse than it's all equally hideous and evil and ugly and awful. But the media doesn't treat it that way because they've got a narrative, and they've got to feed the woke narrative in how they report things now. I think that's really, really dangerous, Jan.
No, totally. And you know what? I think a lot of the time the people who really lose out from this are actually Black people themselves. So in London, there's quite a big problem with knife crime. We tend to stab people rather than shoot people in the UK. I'm sorry to have to say. But the biggest victims of knife crime in London tend to be young, very young Black men. But the perpetrators of knife crime are also young Black men. It tends to be drug-related, gang-related, and nihilistic acts of violence. But because of this refusal and reluctance to suggest, even for 1 second, that there might be a problem within the Black community, or to look at why are young Black men carrying out these acts of violence, it means at the same time that the young Black men who are the victims of this crime, who are actually dying, are not getting the protection and the safeguarding that they deserve.
And is that because the media is afraid somehow to report those stories honestly? Because the same thing happens in Southside Chicago. I had Pastor Donovan on my show. He's a street pastor in Southside who shows up at these gang-related shootings that are out of control every weekend. The numbers are off the charts. I mean, just insane numbers. And that's not covered either because it's Black on Black violence. So it's not discussed openly by anybody except a few commentators on Fox News. But certainly the more ideologically left-driven news media do not talk about it. And that's where the violence is for young Black men. That's where it lives. It lives there.
No, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you say, is it a kind of fear of reporting this? It is, but what's dressed up in that fear is a kind of real contempt for ordinary people, because there seems to be this assumption, particularly with Islamist terrorist acts, that we've had a number of quite horrific Islamist terrorist attacks carried out not just in the UK, but across Europe as a whole. And there's this assumption that if you actually name the problem, if you say there is a particular problem, clearly not with Muslim people, I would make a very sharp and clear distinction between the overwhelming majority of Muslim people and Islamist extremists. But there is an assumption that if reporters even talk about Islamist extremism as a problem, or acts of Islamist terrorism as having cost a lot of people their lives, then these ordinary white working class people are so stupid, so backward, so racist, they will automatically go out and kind of commit acts of violence themselves, which is not grounded in reality, and it's a very contemptuous view of people that will be so stupid as to go out and kind of attack a random Muslim person just because we've heard of an Islamist act of extremism taking place somewhere. But it kind of allows these crimes then to continue and perpetuate, because we can't discuss and label and talk about what's actually happened. But ultimately, it's a kind of anti-racism that masks a very, really a kind of crude, almost racist idea about the ignorance and violent tendencies of white people, working class white people, that we would all just go out and turn into this kind of marauding mass of the first word of anything which we might disagree with.
Well, we saw that kind of thinking here around the trucker convoy, the Canadian Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And what's interesting about, I want to get into the history here with you, because I thought that was really informative. But the idea now that our Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers, and also one of the opposition parties, were using woke ideology to smear and demean the trucker convoy, because their popularity here really suggested the Prime Minister was losing the argument on vaccine mandates, right? So the attack was to wield the common elite-driven smears against working class people, whom they've abandoned, obviously. But the truckers were all racist and misogynistic and homophobic. It was like Hillary Clinton's speech, they were Nazis, and they held unacceptable views, which was a very kind of Goebbelsy, I thought, way of categorizing working class people. Of course, there was no evidence for what they were suggesting. It was nonsense, but it worked, right? He managed to turn the rest of the people who cleave to this ideology against the truckers, with no justification for the criticisms he made. So it's now a bludgeoning tool. We're seeing it. It's Thursday today, the day we're recording this. It's June 9th. And the January 6th committee in the States is doing some kind of a live TV show about all the white supremacists in the Republican Party, namely through the lens of the January 6th events in DC. And they do the same thing. They did it with the Donald Trump voters. And now anybody who votes Republican is all of those terrible things that they say. So I think it's important for people to understand the history, especially with the left. Why did the left and the left-leaning parties go from being the champions of working people to people who actually hate working people, unless they're dividing them up into identitarian categories? Give me the history of that and how it happened.
No, I think that's a really good question. The other thing that really struck me as interesting, and I think this is very relevant to your question in relation to the Canadian trucker convoy, particularly a discussion that we seem to be having about that in the UK amongst people who were very much aligned with left-wing groups, is a kind of redefinition of the working class. So what we were told was that the truckers were not actually working class people at all, because we were told, if you could afford to buy this huge lorry, then you were obviously very wealthy. But also, I mean, I come from a very left-wing background myself. Politically, my trajectory, I'm kind of come from a Marxist tradition. I was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party from late teens. And so you see how this Marxist terminology, which I would be very familiar with, has then been kind of twisted beyond all recognition. So we're told that if you own a truck, then actually you own the means of production. So that means that you are a capitalist because you own a truck, whereas the people who sit at home with a laptop are kind of working for a nice corporation, have their gold-plated pension, are able to be there when the children get home from school, their nice house, thank you very much. They're the real working class. And this is just laughable. I mean, it just turns reality on its head. The idea that the people who had to go out to work throughout the whole of COVID, who had to deliver goods to keep society on its, keep us going, essentially, to allow middle class people the luxury of locking their doors and hiding for 2 years, that we needed working class people to carry on going out to work, to keep the supermarkets stocked up. We needed the lorry drivers. And yet now sections of the left are going to turn around and say, well, they are the capitalist enemy, and it's the laptop classes that are the real working class. I mean, that it's just laughable. But what's revealing in that is that it just shows the extent to which the left are so much more comfortable talking to and talking about this laptop class of kind of professionals. And they are so disdainful of the lorry drivers that they have no ability to kind of communicate with them, to talk to them, and not even no ability, no interest, absolutely no interest. So they kind of just then write them off as, well, they're the real capitalists, in this kind of bizarre attempt to discredit them and suggest that the left should have nothing to do with them whatsoever, while somehow managing to retain the moral high ground. But anyway, sorry to go back to your question.
I'll get back to my question in a minute, but I just want to respond to that, because I think it's really interesting, because what happened here, you have the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers and the rest of the cowards up on Parliament Hill who were threatened by an actual populist movement. And remember, they were making a lot of money. The crowdfunding for the truckers was off the charts. And then they pulled that away. They started a new one. Again, it was up at 8 million in like a few days. They had the support of all levels of people. It was not just a working class, primarily working class. But what was shocking about that was the level of threat that posed to the wokerati, right? Because it wasn't just what the Prime Minister was saying and his cabinet and others on the Hill. It was also, many high-profile, highly paid BMW driving columnists in this country were calling them hillbillies. Never met them, never went there, spent absolutely no time getting to understand who the truckers or their leaders were, and wrote the most ghastly things about them, most of which, I think virtually all of which, turned out not to be true. So it was shocking for me to see how the wagons were circled around this group of people. And I'm talking about the so-called elites that you write about. I mean, they just were terrified of an uprising by people who said, we're not going to take these mandates anymore. So anyway, I did my thing. I had to say that.
But no, and sorry, just to come back on that as well. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you. And the thing that struck me about the crowdfunding money being pulled away is that we kind of sometimes make this divide between the private sector and the public sector, and we assume that it's the public sector that's been really imbued with these woke ideas, and that the private sector kind of still has at root some kind of drive to make money, or something that will override the excesses of woke thinking, or some people make that case. But I think the way that crowdfunding money was pulled away just shows the extent to which that barrier between the two, private sector and public sector, is really artificial. That when it comes to promoting a kind of dominant woke set of ideas, the two are completely in cahoots with each other. Where if PayPal and those other companies hadn't taken the decision to withdraw money, the government, Trudeau, would have had to have stepped up even more and become even more authoritarian. And they kind of, almost like a seesaw, it seems to me, look at each other, take it in turns to be the people who are going to operate these crackdowns.
And one of the banks has apologized actually for doing it, and they should. They should be ashamed of themselves, because they didn't even wait. I don't believe there were any legal challenges on behalf of the banks, on behalf of their customers. We've seen this in the States too. They're using these kind of financial punishments. I know that I think the Bank of America handed over data to the January 6th committee, so that the January 6th committee and the FBI could tell who was in Washington and track them that way. I mean, what the hell is going on? And that would not, and this is why you are here, because that would not be possible unless, as you just said so brilliantly, the corporations, big corpa, we put it that way, big corp, now share this ideology, right? That the days of managing a company for shareholder value, which I always had a bit of a problem with, but for value and making money, is kind of over. They're now involved in this miasma of woke politics in these terrible things they now call public-private partnerships, which absolutely terrify me. I mean, it was just shocking how quickly they capitulated. And I think the banks here now realize they made a mistake, especially, just FYI, since the government is being shown through these hearings and reporting, some of it mine, that they lied about needing the Emergencies Act, and they lied about the truckers as well. So let's move on to where I was trying to take you before we got sidetracked in that really interesting moment. But what is the history? How did this happen? What forces kind of came together in the last, let's say, 10 years to make all of the pillars of this kind of elite managerial governing class buy into something that is inherently illogical and dangerous? I mean, besides Donald Trump, what happened?
No, I mean, it's a good question. It's also a huge question, and there's no one straightforward answer, unfortunately. But I think you can see lots of different strands of things coming together. So I think there's definitely a kind of academia strand, if you like. There's different things that have played out within universities. Most of the people who are kind of the woke people who are fronting now these institutions, these corporations, these public sector bodies, they're your social science graduates, they're your humanities graduates. And there's been various trends in academia that you can point to of kind of critical theory, of kind of moving away from objectivity towards subjectivity, of a privilege. I mean, it was Meghan Markle's phrase in her Oprah interview, which I thought was very revealing about kind of my truth. Yeah. And this idea that there is no kind of sense of objective truth, but we just have standpoints, and we have to just unquestioningly respect other people's standpoints. So you can see the academic strand, but I actually think what's gone on politically is a lot more interesting and a lot more has a lot more power to explain what's happened. And for that, unfortunately, I think you have to go back a bit more than 10 years. I think we almost have to go back kind of 30, 40 years. I would go back to, certainly in the UK, really the kind of late 70s, early 1980s. And this sense of left-wing parties giving up on working class people. Obviously, it wasn't one thing that happened overnight. You know, it's a very, very gradual process. But this sense that if you wanted to bring about change in society, rather than actually convincing working class people to come over to your side and convincing them by the power of your arguments, or if you couldn't convince them, working out why you were so at odds with where the majority of working class thought was, there was this growing sense that it was much easier and kind of politically more expedient just to abandon the working class altogether, give up on them, and enact change through either supranational institutions like the European Union, the United Nations, or to look at kind of human resource departments within institutions, to look at how you could kind of bypass the population and bring about change through more bureaucratic means. And I do think what really lies at the bottom of that is this shift from and it kind of comes with this emergence of a graduate class, and there's various ways you can measure it. I mean, if you look at the politicians that actually constitute not just the British Parliament as a whole, but the Labour Party, I mean, the clues in the name Labour was supposed to be the party to represent working class people. But you look at now, you kind of trace over a 40-year period, the proportion of Labour Party MPs who are graduates, who've kind of got either had professional jobs before they came into Parliament or have only ever worked within politics, who've gone straight from university to being a kind of parliamentary private secretary or having a kind of backroom office job for the Labour Party and then become a Labour Party MP. And it's almost as if kind of dealing with striking minors, for example, is just a waste of time. These people are likely to be racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic. They probably voted for Brexit in the UK. They probably voted for Trump in the US. You know, why get your hands dirty dealing with those backward people? Instead, that these people need to be managed, controlled, regulated, put in their boxes, or treated as these pathetic victims who are the kind of subject of contempt. But we certainly can't let them have agency and control, not even over their own lives, never mind over society as a whole. And the more the left's kind of given up on the working class as a positive force for social change, the more they've decided to operate through institutions, and the more their ideas then have grown very, very distant from the ideas that the majority of people in society would have.
See, that is very, very interesting because I read quite a bit of Thomas Frank, who I know you quote in the book too. He's Listen Liberal was kind of a life-changing book for me. I highly recommend it. But that raises the question, was the political left's attachment to the working man purely cynical, or was there actually, a love of that segment of culture and society that they felt needed supporting? In other words, their ability to abandon them because they may not that they do, but they may not hold acceptable views, to quote our Prime Minister, suggests that their connection to them previously was not a heartfelt commitment to raising people up who needed help.
I agree with you completely. And I think you can trace sections of the left, go back over 100 years and beyond. You can trace certain sections of the left. I'm thinking of kind of the Fabians in the UK, who've always had this slightly disdainful, almost contemptuous relationship to the working class, even at the very same time as they were purporting to champion them. It was almost as if the championing of them was based on the fact of them being victims, being in need of protection, and it's almost as if this is how we demonstrate our compassion. So it kind of becomes about us demonstrating our compassion towards these poor victims who need our help. But I guess at one point, at best, in left-wing movements, there wouldn't have been this separation between a kind of elite cheerleaders, if you like, or elite spokespeople and the working class. I mean, in my kind of ideal political vision, the working class would be the spokespeople. There wouldn't be that distinction. Working class people would be able to speak for themselves. And in a way, the very point at which you get this class of elite spokespeople who think they can act on behalf of and speak as representatives of the working class, that very distinction between kind of them and us is in and of itself a problem, because it suggests that working class people are not agents of change themselves, but need other people to act on their behalf.
Well, I guess in this day and age, if there was another, say, solidarity type movement out of Poland, like Walenza's life's work, that he'd probably be accused of being a racist and a misogynist and run out of town. I mean, those people are not respected and admired anymore. And what's interesting about that is this kind of accepted blanket condemnation that they do hold these anti-woke views, right? I've seen no evidence of that. That they hold these views any more than anybody else has. I know that I occasionally hear people, working class people, say things that are politically incorrect. That's not the same as being racist, right? They don't sit around studying up on what the current vernacular is. And I think that the elites use that in order to diminish them because of their own hypocrisy on those issues.
Absolutely. And I think it's not, you're absolutely right. It's a way of putting down working class people because they don't have the correct vocabulary, even though exactly as you say, their instincts may be entirely correct and actually much more genuinely progressive, genuinely anti-racist than some of these kind of woke pretenders. But I think it's not just a way of kind of putting people down, but it's also a way of preserving their own elite interest. It becomes a kind of a closed shop. If you've got the correct vocabulary, then you're part of a club, and it becomes a way of pulling rank and actually protecting elite interests. And, I think that's one of the worst things about woke, is that how it kind of appropriates some of the genuine disadvantages experienced by some groups of people within society. There is inequality, and that's a fact, and working class people bear the brunt of that inequality more than anyone else. But the way the elite game of identity politics plays is that they can take these genuine disparities, these genuine inequalities that exist, and kind of appropriate it for elite ends, so that they can kind of pass off as if these are their inequalities, this is their suffering, or alternatively, but they are the only people who are capable of managing this. And it's entirely self-interested. It looks compassionate, but it's entirely about them preserving their own position. I mean, if there was no poverty in the world, these people would be out of a job. That's the bottom line. If there was, perhaps poverty is a bad example to use there. But if there was no racism whatsoever, so many people would lose their jobs now, would lose their livelihood. I mean, look at spare a thought for poor Robin DiAngelo. I mean, if there was no racism, what would poor Robin DiAngelo do? I mean, she'd be losing her livelihood. I mean,
which is huge, by the way.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Millions and millions and millions in the race grid.
So what that means is that it's in their best interest to keep racism alive. It's in their best interest to kind of keep racial divisions going, so that they then have a purpose to play in relation to all of this.
I just want to kind of take us off topic for a moment, because you mentioned Meghan Markle. And I wanted to say, I don't know how closely you were following the Jubilee.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was following it really closely. I enjoyed every minute, but especially the Paddington Bear skit. But I have to say, from across the pond, from someone who enjoys, being part of the Commonwealth, that well played, Your Majesty, with Harry and Meghan.
Absolutely.
I thought, well, why are you inviting these two? They've been nothing but dumping on you and exploiting their titles, and and then she invites them, and actually that weekend was the best thing she could have done, because they had to live with the consequences of their actions. And they were even booed coming out of St. Paul's, as I understand it. And I think it really kind of worked to put them in their places in a very gracious way. Didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But we've seen that before from the Queen. And I thought that one of the really brilliant examples of this was, again, after the famous Oprah interview that they did, where they were, scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous, trying to say, without naming name, and therefore casting a pall of suspicion over everyone, to suggest that there were people in the royal family who had kind of made racist remarks towards them. And again, Meghan's phrase about her truth, I'm speaking my truth. And the Queen, kind of via Buckingham Palace, issued this statement afterwards. And it was a very, very short statement, and it just said, recollections may vary. So, yeah, well played. Absolutely, recollections may vary. Yeah. And it's very, very clever, because it's not saying you're lying or you're making this up. But it's saying, if you've got your truth, well, bear in mind the flip side to that is that other people may have their truth too, and their truth may be different to yours.
Well, what's interesting about Harry and Meghan, and the fact that they kind of came up organically in this conversation, is the idea that they are the perfect kind of American couple, media couple, because they're both, I think he's maybe more vacuous than she is, but they both bleat woke talking points. They don't live a life of any commitment to the ideals they talk about. They flew in on a massive private jet, and yet America likes them a lot more than the Brits do. And in that way, I think that really shows a difference in the two countries, that to see the Queen on the balcony, the singing of God Save the Queen at the end there, her in the green suit. I mean, I kind of choked up about it a little bit. I think she's a pretty amazing lady. And it signified that in the British culture, there is still value in duty and dignity and trying to do the right thing over a long period of time, right? The wokesters like Harry and Meghan want instant gratification, instant money. I know everything, you know nothing, and virtue signal, virtue signal, virtue signal, right? And that's, I would say that the UK has kind of kept a bit of something that America has now relinquished. Those values are not in any way applauded in America anymore.
No, and I think what's so interesting about Meghan is that she makes all of this, I'm sure entirely accidentally, but she makes all of this very, very explicit. So another famous interview that she gave, I think it was in Malawi. It was when they were still working members of the royal family, and they'd gone on a tour to Africa. And she did this very kind of tear-filled, wobbly-chinned interview to camera. And she said, I've just had a baby, and no one even asked me how I am. And you just thought, blimey, how to make this all about you? You're standing in one of the poorest countries on earth, surrounded by these kind of wonderful people, but who are, desperately poverty stricken. You're there to highlight a particular cause, and you're complaining to camera that no one asked you how you are. But she carried on in that interview, and she kind of said, well, we've tried this stiff upper lip thing, and it doesn't work. You can't just survive, you have to thrive. And it's all very kind of cliched and stuff, but this idea that with this stiff upper lip, we tried that, it didn't work. We gave that a month and it wasn't very good for us. So we're moving on now. It completely rides roughshod and trivializes a kind of mentality which was not just British. I wouldn't pretend it was just British, although I guess it has become more of an archetypal British trait.
Yeah, pretty British.
But I guess the Queen, very much symbolises that stiff upper lip. But you could say in a previous era, it was the stiff upper lip mentality, perhaps, that won 2 world wars. And
Yeah, so, but I about them, just because it is in the book, even you mentioned this, and it's one of the things I wrote in my notes as I was reading it to talk to you about, is the idea that Harry, in the most woke way, is now this kind of champion of mental health and self-care, this kind of wellness industry mantra about looking after yourself. And for me to say this as a mom is probably terrible, but it sounds really narcissistic and self-serving. I'm sorry. To go on the way that he goes on about his mental health. I think, my view, were I diagnosing her, I would say she's got a pretty serious personality disorder of some sort. And that he's being manipulated, obviously responsible for his own trouble. But for the two of them to hang their hats on mental health as an issue when he is behaving like an entitled little git, to use an English UK slang, is kind of beyond, right? Like, it's like he is the least of the people. Because you know why I'm saying this? I'm going on too long about it, but it really bothered me because he hasn't sacrificed anything, right? He hasn't, work and jobs don't always have to be fun, every minute. You don't have to be finding your bliss every minute. And woke ideology also kind of panders to that kind of thinking about oneself. And I'm probably two-faced about it because I do think we need to look after ourselves. But there's too much of it going on right now. People need too much. You mentioned who were the two young athletes? There was a tennis player, Simone, what's her name?
Biles. She's the gymnast.
Yeah, sorry, the gymnast. And then there was a young tennis player as well, who needed to take a break because it was all too much. It's sort of like, dude, you play a sport, you're good at it, you make millions, just keep on going. I'm not sure we're doing each other a favor, but that is very much also a part of the woke ideology, isn't it? That kind of selfish, narcissistic focus.
Well, it absolutely is. And again, at risk of taking us back to something we've already spoken about, I think lockdown ramped this up massively. And particularly in the UK now, for the past few months, there's been this huge push in some quarters to get people back to work, to kind of say, look, we're now staring a different crisis in the face, which is economic collapse. I mean, really serious economic problems with a huge cost of living crisis for many people. And so we've got to get society back moving again. We've got to get people back to work. And the absolute reluctance of, again, the kind of laptop class that I was referring to earlier, of civil servants in particular, to actually get back into the office, it horrifies me. It absolutely horrifies me. And it's having such real world consequences, where people who are applying for a driving license, people who are applying for a passport, are finding themselves caught up in delays, work permits, the fundamental administrative processes that allow people to work, allow people to get on with their lives, have just ground to a halt. And I mean, hospitals as well, we have massive backlog now with cancer patients, people who've not even been diagnosed yet, but statistically must be there in the population. But we still have doctors insisting on not seeing patients face-to-face, university lecturers who won't do face-to-face lectures, still want to do online lectures. And this is shoring up so many problems. But the reason why their justification for not getting back to normality is actually not. They're not saying, they're still scared of COVID. They're not saying that. But it's this assumption that the entire world revolves around their well-being,
Right.
revolves around their mental health, their right not to be stressed or put under too much pressure. But yeah, it makes me feel very old, and I'm not, but it makes me feel very old because I just think, you don't get paid to protect your lifestyle. A job's not just about your well-being and how you feel. You actually have a duty in return for the money to do what's expected of you, and you can't just sit at home and, well, it feels good for me, to only do 3 or 4 hours a day and, spend the rest of the time looking after my children, cleaning my kitchen, whatever. But that's better for my mental well-being. Therefore, I insist that you pay me just to do that. But no, it's exactly the same kind of woke classes who are then now promoting this agenda where your own well-being, your own lifestyle essentially would be a more trivial way of putting it, but that's essentially what they're arguing for. My lifestyle is the number one thing that matters.
I think that the ideology has played into this in another way, and I think the way it has is that we are super divided, obviously now, and they've done that. They've divided us up, and what happens as a result of that, and then the angle of people wanting to WFH, I think you guys call it,
Yeah.
right? Boris is going to legislate WFH. Is the idea that when you get up and you get dressed and you go somewhere where there are other people committed to the same thing that you're doing, and you have lunch and you have a coffee and you chat about your children and the soccer match or the whatever happened over the weekend, and you shop in the little store under your office and you're dry cleaning, all those things are what is building a community that you're part of. And that's blown up. So now the dry cleaner has to go broke, and the restaurant that used to serve lunch to this whole office tower has gone under. Like the ramifications of allowing that to go on one more minute are huge for all of us in every country that allowed this to happen, and that is kowtowing to this childishness, I think, is how I would, and selfishness. It's just ruining everything,
It is. And I mean, the most obvious side effect of what you've just described there is economic. I mean, working class people, particularly your small business owners, are really, really feeling the consequences of this. And of course, for all the kind of left-wing support for kind of shop local, during lockdown, everybody ordered stuff from Amazon, and there were some very, very clear winners from lockdown, and it was big business. It wasn't your local self-employed person. But so, I completely get what you're saying, and I think the economic effects are absolutely ruinous, but I think there are other social consequences which actually trouble me even more. And this struck me maybe after 3 or 4 weeks into our first lockdown in the UK, how all the conversations that I would normally have with people who, I'll be completely honest, perhaps have very little really in common with, but all the kind of incidental conversations that you'd have, when you're standing on the platform waiting for your train, when the train's crowded, so you end up sitting next to someone on the train, when you go into the shop to order your coffee, before 9 o'clock in the morning, I may have had, in my old life, in the kind of pre-lockdown world, just commuting to work before 9 o'clock in the morning, I may have had 5 random conversations with neighbours, people queuing up, people who are not necessarily in my social circle, people who I've not gone out of my way to choose to have a conversation with. But you overhear and you pick up and you get some sense of what they're thinking. And you feel as if you come to feel as if you have something in common with those people, even if it's just being crammed into the same train carriage and having that same experience of commuting. Lockdown took all of that away. And not only was that economically ruinous, but socially, it meant it put us all into bubbles. Suddenly, the only people who I was talking to, outside of my own immediate family, were people who I'd consciously chosen to have a conversation with, who I would either phone up, or people who I already knew. I wasn't meeting people accidentally. I wasn't meeting new people in the course of my life. And socially and politically, the impact of that was that I only spoke to people who already agreed with me. I only heard reflected back views that I already had. And I'm not trying to big myself up as being particularly brilliant or anything, but at least I was aware of that. And I was aware that this was a problem. But you think this has been replicated on a mass scale. And you get the sense that a lot of people were actually incredibly pleased. How nice not to have to go and speak to the dry cleaning man. How nice not to have to go and speak to the woman at the coffee shop. How nice not to be crammed in this commuter train, overhearing all these conversations you might not want to hear. But the social consequence about kind of us being put in these bubbles of the like-minded, I think will have very long-standing disastrous consequences for kind of a cohesion of society and make us much more divided.
Well, I completely agree with you. And I think it's very, very dangerous. I mean, I kind of remember a time in my youth when the people in the shops and doing those kinds of jobs around us they were also people who were kind of on their way to the middle class, right? So your neighbor might be somebody who owned a small dry cleaning store down the street. And so you knew them, right? There's a Sesame Street song where they identify the people in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it says like, there's the shoemaker's person in your neighborhood, right? And the idea that they're creating now completely false on Sesame Street was a reflection of the old way of living where people weren't so stratified by money. They saw each other every day in various circumstances, and they felt they were part of a community, right? That no longer exists. And I think that COVID rules about work from home and isolating and all that stuff has made that even worse and made the stratification even bigger. And I think this is true, Joanna. I think this is changing our brains. I think that lack of exposure to random social encounters, just like you described on the train, say you were taking into London, wherever, is something that uses a muscle that we need to use to be happy and connected. And I think, and I've seen it in myself, that when you stop using it, it's harder and harder to do, and you become a grumpier, more selfish person. I think that's what they've done.
Yeah, definitely. But it's also politically important as well, because it's far more difficult to demonize people politically if you can put a human face to them, if they are the people that you see as your neighbors in your local coffee shop on your train journey. When you stop being able to put that human face to people, it becomes so much easier to dehumanize them, to just write them all off as these backward, prejudiced, horrible people who you don't want to have anything to do with. And that's deeply troubling.
Yeah. Well, you know what's interesting? Barry Weiss, when she quit the New York Times, wrote a letter about how there was this kind of uprising within the newsroom against her that bullied her out of the office because she supported the publication of an op-ed by Tom Cotton, who's a Republican, who I think was suggesting they should call in the National Guard against Black Lives Matter. So this is an opinion. And the newsroom rose up against her. We don't feel safe when we're publishing this. Da, da, da. And I talked to somebody about why it happened the way it did and why it happened so extremely and so quickly. And if you trace it back, that is when the reporters and the newsroom were working from home, right? So a circumstance where they might have passed Barry Weiss in the hallway and said, "Oh, Barry, I don't really like the Tom Cotton thing." And you discuss it over a coffee or maybe argue over a coffee. Those things are never diffused. And so the work from home, angry New York Times reporters became the mob that drove Barry out of the paper.
No, completely. We are aware of this phenomenon on social media. We're aware that Facebook, Twitter kind of create these communities of the like-minded. And we have that pointed out to us a lot, that this is a problem. But then what lockdown did was to completely replicate that in real life. It made physical bubbles, never mind social media bubbles. And suddenly it stopped being considered to be a problem anymore.
We're running out of time, so I want to keep going to the end here, because the gist of your book for me explained a lot of what's wrong in the world right now. And for people who feel, as I know some do, and there are days when I do myself, think that a lot of the bad things we're experiencing right now, which is the results of very, very bad COVID public health policy, the complete ignoring of what the majority of people in a population want and how they want to be governed, the smearing of working people, the ineptitude of the governing class. I mean, look at America right now. What a disaster. Your airports are bad. Ours are insane. I mean, it's just, nothing is working the way it's supposed to work. And if you question it, they attack you. And I guess what I'm saying is, some people say, oh, it's a conspiracy and it's fueled by the WEF. And I do believe there's an element of kind of circular back padding that goes on there. And I think Klaus Schwab is probably a terrible guy. But I think the other part of it is that what's really going on here is that a lot of like-minded people driven by absurd ideology are now in charge of our world, and we are seeing the results of that. Is that the gist of it? That's what I got from your book, and it made the world make sense to me for the first time in a very long time.
Definitely. No, and I think there are a number of problems with this like-mindedness. It means that you can end up promoting the most ridiculous initiatives around woke thinking. And when you only run it past people who agree with you, nobody points out the flaws or the problems, and things just get nodded through that shouldn't be nodded through. I mean, one newspaper article in the UK this morning, for example, is about advertising health checks for women who may be suffering from ovarian cancer, and kind of how information around ovarian cancer is presented. And kind of the big scandal is that the word woman has been removed from this, and kind of discussion about whether it's right or not to include the word woman. You just think, how could you be so stupid as to even raise this as an issue? Of course, the word woman should be in there. Most people don't go around saying, hello, I'm Joanna, I'm a person with ovaries. People might not even know that this could apply to them if you don't have the word woman in there. So I think you see the problems very quickly when you've got this combination of a particular dominant ideology, this kind of woke ideology, and this like-minded thinking, kind of groupthink that comes together with the people running our institutions.
And let me just say that it's not just that it's groupthink; it's that it's mean, inept, tautological groupthink, right? Like if it was groupthink that was really smart people thinking really good things that were fair, who would care, right?
No.
But they are people who have embraced the kind of thinking that marginalizes actual women. We are not. I said this to Julie Bindel when she was on last year. Women are now kind of the dog poo on the heel of the social justice movement, right? They hate us. They want to erase us. We cannot defend ourselves. And there's a cruelty in that. There's a cruelty in not being able to say the word mother. I mean, what are they doing? So when you've got the groupthink and you understand that it's an unhealthy, toxic groupthink, right? That they can't, you can't even argue them out of, because what they say is a tautology. That is why we're in the place we're in right now.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. The only thing I would add to it as well is that there's just there's a mean, exactly as you say, political side to this, which is just cruel and horrible, and is entirely ideologically and politically loaded and driven. But pragmatically and practically, they're just complete idiots.
Yeah.
I mean here, but what's missing when you get this groupthink is any input of common sense. So you raised the issue of airports, major thing in the UK right now. But like, who'd have thunk it? Completely shut down global travel for 2 years and then click your fingers and expect it to all start up immediately. And guess what? It doesn't. Like, oh, how stupid do you have to be to think that you can just shut down the entire global economy for 2 years, and this won't have major repercussions that are playing out for many, many years to come? I mean, who would have thought that you can keep children out of school and the poorest children from the most disadvantaged homes are going to suffer most, and there's going to be huge learning loss, huge social problems that come from this? It just seems like if they'd asked any kind of random person off the street to idiot check these proposals,
Yeah.
any random person with zero qualifications, never mind lists and lists of university degrees, would have said, well, oh, hang on a minute, have you thought about this? Or do you not think this might happen? But because they're in these kind of group, I think, like kind of like-minded communities, it seems like not one person thought to say, well, hang on a minute, don't you think this might be a consequence? And we're all now living with the repercussions of their idiocy, it seems to me. And it's unforgivable. I hope we never, ever forgive sections of the political class for what they've inflicted upon us.
Oh, listen, I'm with you, sister. I hope that there is a major accountability push, but I don't think there will be. And I'll tell you why. Because the media doesn't want there to be, because they were complicit in it and they know it.
Absolutely.
Right. They're complicit and they know it. But there was, just speaking of your saying, any person with average intelligence could have said this. Actually, someone did. There was a really great kind of man on the street interview with a little old lady in London in an adorable hat. And somebody asks her about lockdowns, and she said, oh, it's the stupidest thing they've ever done. Why didn't they just protect the people who needed protection? Why are they doing this? They're ruining the economy. This was like way back in 2020. She had it totally figured out. And that is the thing. It's like the working class people have their wits about them. And that's why the truckers were important. They were saying sensible things that contradict the insanity of the woke class, right? Which is probably why they were such a threat. But I say to my best girlfriend, I used to travel a lot doing documentaries, and I would get in the car, and if I had an immigrant cab driver, I always wanted to have a big discussion. They're usually PhDs or something, right?
Yeah.
From India or whatever. They always said the smartest thing of anybody on the whole trip. They understood the Iraq War was a stupid disaster, and they had they just sort of get it. And I think we've been heading in that direction where the people who are the most educated, I'm not anti-education, but the people who are the most educated now are the ones who are the least able to think critically about anything.
Completely. No, absolutely. And we see this in so many areas of life. And it's all of this links back. I think all of these things are interconnected. The whole thing of what happened in lockdown with the woke policy making. And one of the things that I find very heartening at the moment is looking to see how mums, it is mainly mums, I think, in the US, are responding to critical race theory, for example, being taught to children in schools, or kind of ideas that stem from critical race theory being implemented in the classroom. And those mums are not racist, but they're standing up and they're saying to the teachers, hang on a second, isn't getting our children to judge each other according to the color of their skin, isn't dividing them up according to the color of their skin, isn't that actually racist? Isn't this kind of racializing children at the youngest age? And good on those mothers. I'm really pleased that they're out there and that they're having that fight. They shouldn't have to, but I'm really pleased that they are. And it takes the kind of the ordinary mum on the street, if you like, to prick this pomposity of these woke elites who assume that they are the only people who know how to challenge racism, that they've got all the right answers when it comes to what children should be taught in school as about sex and relationships, for example. And then it takes the mum to stand up and say, actually, I think this is very backward and is actually racist rather than challenging racism. And no, my 4-year-old doesn't need to have a story read by a drag queen in order to grow up being a nice, tolerant person.
Oh, yeah.
So just to open another can of worms there.
No, I'd be homeschooling. I mean, my boys are grown, but I'd be homeschooling. I mean, the sexualization of children, the bringing sex toys. I mean, I don't know what's happened. I don't know how they justify it. I don't know how they defend it. I don't get it at all. The bowing to the god of woke over the mental health of your own children is something I will never, ever endorse or understand. And of course, we see it in the trans movement that is luring young people through social contagion into thinking things that maybe they should be given a minute and a half to figure out before we start, lopping off body parts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just awful. I'm doing a whole show on trans ideology with a woman who, through journalism, has discovered how it got so big so quickly. And there's always a story behind these things, right? People wake up and one day, all of a sudden, if you're not totally on board with an idea that you find dangerous, you're a monster. And everybody's saying that. You're like, what? How did that happen? Yeah. So we're going to be looking at that in an upcoming show. I want to close with your final chapter where you said it really has permeated everything. We have to look at our whole world now as being contaminated with this thinking. What do we do about it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. And one comment I've had made to me quite a lot is that, isn't the title of my book, How Woke Won, isn't that kind of very depressing or very defeatist? I hope it's not. I hope it's not a depressing book, and I hope it's not a defeatist book. I certainly don't mean it to be. But I do think we don't do ourselves any favors whatsoever by burying our heads in the sand and not owning up to the scale of the challenge that we're facing in pushing back against this woke thinking. I think we have to be very clear about the extent to which it has taken over so many of our institutions. And I also think we can't be complacent about this just kind of going away of its own accord. Some people kind of like to think that, woke will eat itself somehow, that the inherent contradictions will become too much and it will just, or we'll get kind of bigger problems, like COVID or the war in Ukraine, and this will make it all go away. And I think that's not happening. We have to be honest. This is a major, major problem. We've got to recognize the scale of it. But I think, when I say that, the scale of woke infiltration, I think we also need to be very clear that this is a powerful movement because it's influential, because it's captured these kind of positions of power and authority in society. But at the same time, it's not what most people think. Right. You've got the dominant group in every society, it seems to me, Canada, the US, the UK, of people who actually don't think this at all, who recognize this for the rubbish that it is, who, some of whom perhaps go along with it for a quiet life, decide they just want to kind of work 9 to 5 and come home and spend time with their children and not stick their heads above the parapet and have to worry about all of this, but still haven't deeply brought into it. The proportion of true believers, as I would describe them, the kind of evangelical woke people, I think are a really small proportion of society that are absolutely punching above their weight. And I think ultimately there is safety in numbers, there's confidence in numbers, and that's the very essence of democracy. There's more of us who want to challenge and push back against these woke ideas than there is of them. And what that means is that whenever we can shine the spotlight of kind of sunlight is the best disinfectant, they say. Whenever we can expose what's going on, highlight how ridiculous it is to talk about kind of ovarian cancer awareness without using the word woman, for example, talk about 3-month-old babies as if they were racist. The more we can expose the kind of the idiocy and the cruelty, behind these ideas, the more people are prepared to kind of start speaking up in opposition, because they realize other people are too. And ultimately, the best source of that fight back is the ballot box. You go and you put your cross on a piece of paper. One campaign that I really, really like that's going in the UK at the moment is it's a gender critical feminist group, and they've started a campaign with the slogan, respect my sex if you want my X, the X meaning the cross in the ballot box. So it's a campaign when there's elections going on to say to candidates who are standing in the election, can you tell me what is a woman? And if that person can't say, a woman is an adult human female, well, you don't get my X. You're not having my cross when it comes to voting in that election.
Brilliant. That's
it is.
Would you do me a favor? Do me a favor and send me by email who the people are.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I want to get that going here. I want to connect it to the show. I want to get that going here. I am so, 2-3 years ago, I was terrified of rough. I'm not. Screw it. Women have to say enough already, and they can turf us and schmurf us and try to kill us or whatever happens when you speak out about extreme ideology. I personally have had enough. I've had enough. And I think we've got to really say, especially to male politicians who think they're doing us a favor by behaving this way, that they have to stand up for it too. Somebody has to, right? You can't just you can't let them erase us from reality.
No, definitely. And I think, you can be very heartened by some successes that we've seen in this direction. It's harder. Pandemic and all that, and lockdowns. I've not really traveled as much over the past 2-3 years as I would like to have done. But my instinct is that the UK or England, I think, to be honest, is a lot further down the line, or a lot more open to criticizing transgender ideology, to women sticking up for themselves, defending their sex-based rights, than perhaps the US or Canada. And I think that's because it's been a kind of cross-party political movement. It's not been able to be ghettoized as a kind of right-wing Christian right women only voice these criticisms.
Right.
In the UK, it's much more radical feminists from the left who are very much at the forefront of this pushback. And I do think it's genuinely had an impact and made it much more difficult for some of the excesses of this movement to really get pushed through. So, when we do come together, when we do make our voices heard, I do think people still can be powerful and make change happen.
Well, I think I agree with you. And I also think that, as I say on virtually every show, the news media is part of the problem. They're totally captured. But when you see some of this ideology confronted the way that Matt Walsh does in What is a Woman? If you haven't seen it, you should. Yeah. They fall apart, right? Like it's not like he's sort of glib, he's a little bit like Michael, what's the guy who did?
Michael Moore.
He's a kind of a bit like a right of center Michael Moore.
Yeah.
He's a bit glib about it, but if you just remove the showbiz angle of it and watch what happens when he pushes, aggressively trans extremism type academics, they fall apart. They want to stop. He asks them simple questions and they want to stop the interview.
Yeah.
It's like they can't take any scrutiny of what they're thinking. They just shut it down, right? And we've seen that before. I did a couple of documentaries exposing satanic ritual abuse and, the fraud of it, and the recovered memory syndrome that was sending innocent people to jail. And it was the same. I'd get them in a situation where we're doing a tough interview and I'm challenging them on various stuff they say that is absurd. And the response was not to engage, but to want us to turn the camera off, walk out of the room, accuse us of being against women and children because we don't believe in sexual abuse, which of course was a lie. Yeah. Right. But it's kind of the same that you can see how clearly the people who are pushing it are also captured by the ideology, right? It is a tautology and they can't seem to think their way through it. It's almost like I have to believe this or I'm going to die or something.
No, completely. I mean, one thing we've not spoken about this afternoon, but it kind of becomes a completely different, a whole new topic in a way, but is the challenge to free speech nowadays and the amount of censorship that there is. I mean, again, a lot of this stems from academia. This is where young people seem to learn nowadays that it's freedom from speech rather than freedom of speech. That's the important position to promote. But across social media, across governments, the controls and limitations on what you can and can't say, it seems to me, are kind of bigger than ever before. And of course, that is totally in the interests of this woke elite, because like you're just describing, they don't want that scrutiny. And what free speech does is it allows us to apply that scrutiny to their ideas and to everything that they're putting out there. Free speech enables us to question it, to think critically about it, to get together and discuss what's wrong with what they're saying. And so I think for me, the challenge to woke really does go absolutely hand in glove with a fight for free speech as well.
Yeah, completely, because the news media is absolutely complicit. And I can tell you there's lots of people I'd love to interview who would never come on the show because they don't feel they have to engage with people who don't think exactly like they do, right? I'm super fair. But they just, even in the indie world and the legacy world talks to some people, we talk to other people. And it's because the people who would normally come on, I would challenge them. I mean, there's a show you guys have talk radio, I think, on maybe GB. She's pretty good. And she was really challenging people on the COVID stuff. And I thought, wow, this is old school, what she's doing. What do you mean? Let's see the numbers. What does the science say? Yeah. Why do you still believe in Neil Ferguson? He's been wrong about everything, whatever, And that's unusual. We don't really have that here. There's a Fox News in the States where Tucker Carlson does some of that pretty well, although that's not true because they don't come on his show anymore. But there are not a lot of accountability interviews to be done. The legacy media here supports our prime minister and his party, and they don't ask too many hard questions. So that's one of the reasons we're stuck, Joanna, I think.
No, completely. And well, we've just got the flip side of that problem in the UK, which is that our media, our legacy media, do not support our Prime Minister, despite the fact that he was elected on this huge majority and has an unprecedented number of seats in Parliament.
Well, they don't like him because he's Brexit, right? They still,
completely. And so and also, I mean, I know Boris Johnson did implement COVID restrictions, and we did have very tight lockdowns in this country that went on for a long time. But at the same time, he was also clearly a little bit skeptical of them himself, and he did bring us out of lockdown perhaps quicker than a few other countries, particularly in Europe. And so for all of those reasons, they don't like him. I mean, they think he has a whiff of populism about him, and they can't bear that. And well, you hit the nail on the head when you said Brexit. That's the biggest thing they don't like. So we have a media which just constantly focused around sniping and backbiting and bringing up kind of really quite trivial, but it just grinds you down. It's just constantly so negative.
Well, that's exactly the same here. Like I know there was one of the BBC specifically is terrible, but on this stuff, but one of them said that he was like Hannibal Lecter or something. Like the things that they say. I mean, look, I hate some of the things Boris did around COVID, and I think the Partygate thing is pretty bad, but you're right. They go after him in ways that are completely, in my view, unfair and diminish their own standing as journalists. You know, they you can tell that the reporters at the BBC hate Boris. You can tell that, and they don't even try to hide it.
No. But again, to come back to almost what you were saying right at the very beginning of this interview, you know, they don't ask the big questions, and they don't ask the big questions because they know that they are implicated. I mean, to me, what the whole Partygate thing with Boris Johnson and what was going on in 10 Downing Street throughout lockdown, what it highlights is the cruelty and the bizarre nature, the impossible nature of the restrictions that we were all expected to live under. And you know, we have on our television news channels this kind of constant parade of people coming out in response to the Partygate affair, saying, you know, oh, Boris Johnson was in 10 Downing Street having a bottle of beer at the same time that my father was dying in hospital and I wasn't able to go and visit him. And that's terrible. You know, that's absolutely wrong. But what's, to me, well, you know, what's wrong in that situation is not the fact that Boris Johnson was having a bottle of beer, but the fact that we didn't let people visit their dying relatives in hospital. Exactly. You know, that's the problem. That's what was morally indefensible. And yet our media are never able to say, you know, what's the big problem here is that you weren't able to go and visit your father when he was dying. They turn it around so that the huge problem was the fact that Boris Johnson was drinking the beer, you know, which was, again, it's hypocritical. It's not something I would defend, but it's not morally the really big issue here. It's not the huge moral problem. But of course, their hands are tied. They can't or won't ask about that bigger issue as to why we stopped people visiting dying relatives, because they were advocating for it. They were absolutely pushing for this to happen, standing up in press conferences night after night. Why don't you lock down? Why aren't these restrictions in place? So they couldn't now criticize those same things.
And that's exactly the same thing happened here. Exactly to a word, the same thing happened here, which is why there's very, very little, if any, accountability for the lockdown and school closure policies. But what I learned from this, Joanna, is that lockdowns and school closures are very much part of the woke ideology. There is a massive dividing line there. If you're woke, you believe in those things. And that's just the way. You can go to someone's Twitter. If they have pronouns, they're pro-lockdown. That's the way it is. You know, and I'll just end on this note. But you know, the example should be, if you really want to get Boris, is Arthur Labanjo Hughes. If you know that story, that poor kid that was beaten to death. His grandmother tried to rescue him, and the cops said, if you go to the house against lockdown regulations, we're going to arrest you. So he was left alone with a crazy, violent stepmother who murdered him under the cover of lockdowns, and the lockdowns and the police enforcing them prevented his rescue.
Awful. I mean,
that should be a headline. Isn't that a headline? That should be a headline.
It won't be, but you're right. I know this story, and it is just unspeakably awful, and people don't want to have to think about it. People are burying their heads in the sand and are not confronting it, not publicizing this. I mean, I hate to say it, but my guess is that this is the tip of the iceberg, really. Of course, and there would have been numerous other examples where, fortunately, thank goodness, nobody did die, but where children have been treated horribly, or domestic abuse has been allowed to continue. The kind of illnesses of despair, the drug addiction, alcohol abuse, you know, we're storing up so many social problems for the future, and people will wash their hands with it. It's just incredible what's happened.
Well, I will say this in closing, that woke ideology seems to be a kind of a moral get out of free card for these people. You know, they do so much damage. And you've used the word cruel many times in this interview. It's a word I also started using during COVID. I was seeing so much state sanctioned and societally sanctioned cruelty. It took my breath away. So I feel like we're on the same page, and I pray for accountability. And I pray that people really understand what we've been saying here today, which is yeah, there may be a conspiracy, and yeah, big pharma is bad. They are for sure. But woke ideology is what is the gateway to allow what's happened to us in the last 5 years to happen. So we need to really be pushing back against it and not being afraid. Don't be afraid. It's okay. We'll be here. Joanna will be there. We'll all still be here. Right? Thanks, Joanna. You're the best. I'm giving 2 copies of your book away too.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. So nice just to, share views and hear what's going on in the US as well, in lieu of being able to travel.
Yeah, same. It's lovely to talk to you too. And have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
So that was Joanna Williams, who's written a book, How Woke Won, which is going to be one of our giveaways. And I just think everything she says puts so much of what we have experienced into perspective. We are dealing with a power elite, which is to say most of the people running the show and running corporate America who are infected with this. It's broad and it's deep. And it's much bigger probably than any of us actually thought. I thought corporations who were doing super woke stuff to the detriment of their own business actually were outliers, but they're not. This is the human resources departments now. That is what they do. They ask employees to wear Black Lives Matter buttons and to agree with this particular political or cultural standpoint. I mean, it's as part of the job. It's kind of bad, right? So the human resource departments have really played a big role in this, more than I knew, because I haven't worked with a human resources department in my career in decades. I've been on my own, right? So it's really worth reading the book. I hope it helped you understand a little bit more why we all feel so crazy. It's because we're being governed and interacting with crazy people quite a lot. So I just wanted to say how grateful I am to everybody who responded when I announced that I couldn't attend my son's graduation because I'm unvaccinated and our prime minister won't let me fly. I mean, it was just heartbreaking for me. But you know what I did? I sent my older son, which was probably better because he enjoyed that more. And then I got, from the event, I got some video of him going up to get his diploma, honors diploma, 5 years. So proud. He actually liked school, which I didn't. And everybody was wearing a mask. Everybody. So this moment of absolute joy, you want to see your kid's grinning face in the video, covered up by a mask. And I'm not going to say what school, but it's a big school. It's an important school with a medical school and a big science department who should actually know better than to do that. This was also a school, by the way, where he was forced to get a double vaccination, and then they were locked out of school anyway, learning remotely in another city. I mean, right? So these things are very frustrating for parents. But having said that, I announced that in my Twitter feed, and the response I got was overwhelmingly kind. And more to the point, there were people with even worse stories than that who were unable to see sick and dying relatives because they couldn't travel. So that really fits with the exploration we're doing today about wokeness and the cruelty that seems to attend it. Our prime minister in Canada still has not produced one iota of evidence about why Canadians should not be able to board planes if they're unvaccinated. Vaccines are failing. They're not preventing transmission anymore. And they keep saying they are studying the science. They won't say what this is. Nonsense, right? It's just, he's petulant and he won't give them up. I actually think there was a bit of a signal sent out by Theresa Tam, our federal public health guru. And she says they're reviewing. And so maybe reviewing means that they're going to change it. She said they're reviewing on the basis of Omicron not being really affected by vaccines. Omicron, of course, has been around forever, but this is giving them an out. So I'm hoping that that is going to change. But one thing I will say to our international listeners and listeners in the rest of Canada too, Hospitals in Toronto are still the worst in the world. You're masked, right? You can't visit without a vaccine, I think. Still, you go into the waiting room there and there are plastic screens separating people, which don't work. That's been proven. They've known that for 2 years, right? That screens don't prevent transmission. It's just a ludicrous bit of COVID theater. And it seems that the closer to science they are, the more ludicrous it is, which is, of course, absurd. But they're clinging on to it. And so, anyway, I didn't mean to do another rant about mandates, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for all the kind words. It really meant a lot. Thank you. So check out Joanna Williams' book, How Woke Won, and stay critical. See ya.